This Parsha class for Parshas Vayeishev and Shabbos Chanukah is brought to you by the Intentional Jew Podcast Network. Go check it out on intentionaljew.com.
We're going to discuss the Parsha, which is going to tie in very beautifully to Chanukah, based on an idea that I saw from a sefer called the Shvilei Pinchas, or Pinchas Friedman. Very, very beautiful understanding of the events that took place in this week's Parsha and how they tie into Chanukah. So we know the beginning of the Parsha, Yosef's chaloms, Yosef's dreams, and the reaction of his brothers. Eventually, they take Yosef and they throw Yosef into a pit. And the Torah describes the pit. And the Torah says, "Vayhi kasher ba Yosef elechov." When Yosef came to his brothers, "Vayafshitu es Yosef es kutanto." They stripped him as kusnos hapanim pasim asher alav. Vayikachu vayashlicho sa'abora. And they took him, they threw him into the pit. And then the Torah describes, "V'habor reik." The pit is empty. Ein bo mayim, and there is no water. So Rashi right away says, why is it necessary to tell me that the pit is empty and there's no water? Last time I checked, if the pit is empty, that means there's no water. That means there's nothing there. So it's not necessary to say that the pit is empty and there isn't water. There also wasn't Swiss cheese there either, or Cheerios. There wasn't a lot of things inside of that pit. When you didn't list me the other things, why was it necessary to tell me that the bor rake, the pit was empty, ein bo mayim, and there was no water? So Rashi says that because mimashma shenamar v'abor rake, from the fact that it says the pit was empty, ein yodei she'ein bo mayim, of course there's no water. Ma Talmud lomer ein bo mayim, why does it have to say there was no water? Mayim ein bo, there was no water, but nechashim v'akravim yesh bo. But there was snakes and scorpions in the pit. It wasn't completely empty. It was empty of water. But whenever there is an emptiness, emptiness is filled. The void is filled, and it was filled with snakes and scorpions. Happens to be that you can ask on that, why didn't they see the snakes and scorpions? So that happens to be a question that the Talmud grapples with, and that really is the first connection to the Parsha to Chanukah, because our rabbis answered that the reason why they didn't see the snakes and scorpions is because the pit was deeper than 20 cubits, 20 amos. And when something is deeper than 20 amos or higher than 20 amos, so then your eyes don't catch it. And therefore, the Talmud learns a halacha, both by Sukkah and by Chanukah, that if a Chanukah is higher than Esrim amos, than 20 amos, 20 cubits, so then it's not kosher, because the ayin is not sholate, because the eye doesn't catch it. Okay, so we understand that the pit was empty, there was no water, it was deeper than 20 amos. Why was it necessary, though, for them not to be able to see? Why did it have to be higher than 20 amos? Necessary for them not to know that there were snakes and scorpions inside of the pit. What was the advantage to make it that the brothers wouldn't know that there were snakes and scorpions there? Because the truth is, they would have thought that if they knew that there were snakes and scorpions there, and that Yosef made it out alive when they came to get him to sell him to the Ishmaelim, and that Yosef was unscathed, so then they would have known that there's something special going on here. There's a miracle that happened, that Yosef would have lived through that pit. If they knew that there were snakes and scorpions there, and then they would have said, well, if Yosef's so special, maybe we should stop what we're doing, and we shouldn't sell him to the Ishmaelim, and then the whole story would have been different. And therefore, to ensure that the story wouldn't be different, because it was necessary, as we're going to see, necessary for the story to play out the way that it did, and therefore, they were unaware of the fact, they needed to be unaware of the fact that there were snakes and scorpions. Okay, but that begs the question. If they didn't need to know that there were snakes and scorpions, it wasn't for underscoring the miraculous, that Yosef was saved by God, then why was it necessary to have snakes and scorpions there? Why couldn't it just be habor reik? The pit was empty, leave it at that, and don't tell me that there was no water, but there was snakes and scorpions. Who cares if there was snakes and scorpions? The snakes and scorpions don't really seem to play any kind of role. Okay. With that, I want to tell you an amazing thing. The Svarim bring down that Yosef, Bigematria, in numerical value 156, is the same as the numerical value of Melech Yavan, of the king of Greece, which is the same numerical value as the actual name of the king of the Syrian Greeks, of Antiochus. Wow. Isn't that cool? Who cares? Why does it matter to me? Great. And maybe if you work hard at it, you could also get it the same as a gematria of Swiss cheese. Like, who cares? Why does it make a difference? It's a great thing to point out. It's a very cool fact that Yosef and the Melech Yavan, Antiochus, it's the same number. But what's the shaychus? What's the connection between them? Somehow one is balancing the other. Our rabbis tell us that the sin of the sale of Yosef was only mechupar, it was only atoned for with the story of Chanukah. So that can explain why the numbers are the same. But why does that matter to me? And why would the sale of Yosef, which was based on sinas chinam, which was based on hatred, why would that have been atoned for with the events of Chanukah? That's another question. In the beginning of Parshas, it tells us that when God was creating the world, v'choshech al pnei tehom, and there was darkness on the face of the deep. And our rabbis of the Medrash say that what does that mean? There was darkness on the face of the deep. What was the darkness? That was Yavan. It was Greece. Now, Greece wasn't even a glimmer in God's eye yet. This was thousands of years before Greece. This was before there was a human being on the earth. This was before there was an earth. So what exactly does that mean? Choshech al pnei tehom. You hear the word choshech, you hear the word darkness, you pin it on the Syrian Greeks. Oh, it's them. It's describing them. We could be describing anything. Why would it be? This could be describing Las Vegas. Why are you using it to describe the Syrian Greeks? That choshech al pnei tehom, darkness on the face of the deep. Okay. I'll throw in two more little things. You know, we all know that the Syrian Greeks made decrees. The decrees that they made against the Jews, we know the famous ones, that they told us that we can't keep Rosh Chodesh and that we can't keep Shabbos and we can't have Bris Milah and we can't learn Torah. What we're a little bit less aware of is that they made a decree against Jewish girls, that every Jewish girl was obligated to sleep with the Hagman, the governor of Israel, the Syrian Greek governor, before her wedding. We're also unawares of the fact that they made a decree, Kisvu al Karnei Shor, that we have to write on the horns of an ox, Ein lanu chelek be'elokei Yisrael, that we have no portion with the God of Israel. We'll talk about this maybe next week, that it was perhaps like bumper stickers. The oxen were like their cars, so writing it on the horns of the oxen was like writing on bumper stickers, or the horns of oxen were also used as baby bottles. So it could be it meant to teach your children at a very young age. Be that as it may, this was a major decree that they made against the Jewish people, which many people, again, are unaware of the extent to which they made these decrees to try to wipe things out from us. When we say the words Karnei Shor, or Keren Shor, we think automatically of Yosef. Yosef was called the Bechor Shor. Somehow, they were trying to separate Yosef and the memory of Yosef to try to eradicate that and remove that from the Jewish people. And we have to understand exactly what was in their minds, what was their purpose in disconnecting Yosef from the Jews. One last problem. When this whole story began, the Torah tells me at the beginning of the Parsha, in Pasuk Beis, the Torah says that Elah told us Yaakov, these are the generations of Yaakov. Yosef ben Shvas Rishona Hayoroah es Echav Bitzon, that he was a shepherd with his brothers in the sheep of their father, V'hu Nar, and he was a Nar. Rashi has his own things to say about what it meant that he was a nar, based on the medrash, that he did maaseh narus, he acted like a child. He was very much into his hair. He was into his imprinting himself and making himself kadeshi and yafa, that he would look beautiful. Once you tell me he's a nar, I know that he was young, and it doesn't make a difference what age he was. He was immature. I get that. That Rashi's saying that there was something that wasn't thought out by him. I get that. Why do I need to know that he was 17? I don't need to know it. A lot of times we ask why the Torah gives ages for certain things, because you need to know chronologies. This didn't help at all with the chronology. We had the chronology for this one down. So the Torah is sending me some kind of message when it says that this is the generations of Yaakov, and it doesn't tell me the generations. It tells me about one generation of Yaakov. It tells me about Yosef, and it tells me that when this story took place, Yosef was ben Shvas Rishon. He was 17 years old. Why do I care that he was 17 years old? Okay, let's tie this whole thing together. We know that when Yaakov ran away from his home, from Esav, back 2 Parshas ago, when he ran away, he was forced to run away because Esav was going to kill him. And he went to Haran, he went to his uncle Lavan to find a shidduch. But if you count the years and you do the chronology, you'll realize that there was 14 missing years there. And where were those years? So our rabbis tell us, and I always say that whenever you're missing somebody in the book of Bereshis, just look at Shem and Aver. You'll find them in the yeshiva of Shem and Aver. Every time we're missing a couple of years, the rabbis tell us, oh yeah, he was sitting in yeshiva Shem and Aver. So where was Yaakov those 14 years? Like where's Waldo? Where was Yaakov? He was in yeshiva Shem and Aver. You got to ask the question, $1 million question, sitting there for 14 years. First of all, there was no library. There were no books. What are you doing for 14 years? What, you're doing gymnastics for 14 years? Like, what are you doing? What's the curriculum of Yeshiva Shem Ve'ever? And what is it that he could possibly learn in Shem Ve'ever that he couldn't have learned from the 2 biggest Rosh Yeshivas in the world? Avram and Yitzchak. He learned everything from Avram and Yitzchak. What did Shem and Aver, Shem, the son of Noah, and Aver, the grandson of Noah, what did they have to teach him? So I'll tell you an amazing thing. That up until then, he was living in Yaakov's house. He was living in Yitzchak's house. He had a relationship with his Zayda, with Avraham Avinu. And he was living amongst people who loved God. And now, as Yaakov left the nest of Avram and Yitzchak, now he recognized that he was going into Galus, he was going into exile. He was going to be living in a hostile environment. And now he needed the message. He needed to learn Torah's Galus. He needed to learn how do you live in a hostile environment and not give up who you are. How do you remain true to yourself and committed to your values and ideals without letting them be stolen, be affected by everything else around you? And that's what he needed to learn from Shem and Aver. Shem and Aver were not Avram and Yitzchak. Shem and Aver were not separated. Shem and Aver were not living alone. Shem and Aver were living in the world in a hostile environment. And they had perfected how to live in a hostile environment. And that Torah's Golus, that Torah of how to live in an uncomfortable situation and stay true to yourself, that's what he needed to learn. Yaakov understood that Yosef was going to have that same challenge. And that Yosef was also going to live in a world where he was going to have to figure out how to maintain his values, how to maintain his beliefs in an environment that was not comfortable. So Yaakov Avinu needed to teach Yosef this 14-year lesson. The Torah tells us that he was a Ben Zekunim. Ben Zekunim we translate as being a child of his old age. There are 3 explanations that are brought by our sages of what Ben Zekunim means. And one is that he was his child of Chachma. that Yaakov Avinu knew that he was going to be the spiritual heir of everything that Yaakov had. Not the king, not necessarily the leader, but the spiritual heir. And therefore, Yaakov Avinu prepared him. Yaakov wasn't worried about his dreams. Shomer es hadover. He held on to it because he knew that all of this was where Yosef was going. Yosef was going to be leading, ultimately was going to be setting the stage for the Jewish people, but he was going to be doing it in an environment that was hostile. And therefore, for 40, that teach him a 14-year lesson. When does chinuch begin by a child? Chinuch begins at 3. Yaakov Avinu taught him a 14-year lesson from the age of 3. And that's what the Torah is telling me. He was 17 years old. It was the Torah's way of imparting to me that he was complete. Yosef got the message. At that point, he was ready now to go into Gullus, and it's exactly what happens in the Torah. The very next step, he goes to his brothers, he gets thrown in the pit, and he ends up down in Mitzrayim. Now the story is ready to continue, because Yosef now has the tools that he needs how to live in Gullus. Yosef comes down to Gullus, and the Torah tells me, as we mentioned before, that Yosef was very involved in his physical looks. He was involved in preening his hair, in taking care of himself. And he meets Mrs. Potiphar, who every single day she attacks him. Every single day she tries to entice him. Every single day she challenges him. And then it tells us that he sees Dmus Yukana Shel Aviv, that he sees the figure of his father in the window, and he runs out of the house of Mrs. Potiphar, leaves his coat in her hands, and she then says that he left his coat here because he raped me, and Yosef ends up in prison. What was this grooming? What was this taking care of his hair, of his looks, of his outer appearance? If he got the message from his father, then his life should have been lived on a much higher plane. What was this all about? And our rabbis explain an amazing thing, that Yosef was worried about how he was going to influence and teach in this gullus. Because if he was going to look different than everybody else, he was going to dress different than everybody else, he was going to have a different set of external values than everybody else, it was going to be impossible for him to be able to influence them. Similar to what Avraham Avinu was worried about with his bris milah. That if I'm going to be so different than everybody else from around me, so then how am I going to be able to lift them up and to teach them and expose them to monotheism, expose them to the beauty of God? And therefore Yosef changed his clothing. Yosef changed his looks. He had a hairstyle like everybody else's hairstyle. He was concerned about the way he looked because he was ultimately concerned about the message that he was going to be sending, that the message he wanted to be able to impart in this gullus that he thought would be impossible unless he did that. And then he sees the Mustiyukane Shel Aviv. He sees the figure of his father. And he remembers that lesson that he's been taught for 14 years. Don't assimilate. Don't leave your value system just because you want to share it with others. Don't change yourself so that you are more easily acceptable to others so that you can give it to them. You stay true to who you are and you will light up the world. And that 14-year message now came to fruition as he ran out of the hands of Mrs. Potiphar. That message of hold on to who you are. Amazingly, with that act, Yosef paved the way for our existence in Egypt. That Yosef, there was never in Egypt, in our entire gullus in Egypt, except for one crazy incident where it wasn't even the woman's fault. There was no intermarriage in Egypt. No Egyptian and Jew married each other. There was no child that was fathered by an Egyptian man or by an Egyptian woman. We remained on that level pure in Mitzrayim. On that level, we did not give up who we were. There was a certain external attachment to who we were. Loshinu Shemam. We didn't change our names. We didn't change our clothes. We didn't change our language. Because Yosef was able to hold on, he set the stage of hold on to who you are. And when did this begin? It began in the pit. There were snakes and scorpions in the pit. Snakes and scorpions represent dishonesty, being surreptitious. They represent the negativity. They represent the falseness of Yavan, of Greece, the falseness of our enemies. Whenever something is going to happen on the outside, some major miracle is going to happen, there needs to be what's called an isarusa letato, some event on earth that is going to be the mirror for what is going to happen in the heavens. And only Yosef needed to do this, needed to know this, that here Yosef was being attacked. Yosef was being attacked by snakes. Yosef was being attacked by things that aren't even. We spoke about this once, about things that are the representative, the quintessence of things dishonest and things not real, of things that look one way but are something else. And Yosef was able to come out unscathed from the pit, and that set the stage for Yosef's ability to be able to come out unscathed from all of the attacks in his life. Yosef represents not losing ourselves, not mixing into our environment, staying true to who we are. That's what the Syrian Greeks were trying to do to us. They were not trying to kill us. The only time that they were trying to kill us is when we waged war against them. They were trying to snuff out our spirit. They were trying to make us assimilate and become like them. That's why it says, V'timu kol hashmanim. They made all the oils impure. Because what is oil? Oil, pure oil, when you mix it with water, it doesn't mix. It's a liquid that stays separate. We learn in the Maoz Tzur, when you sing it tonight, Ufartzu chomos migdalai, they made breaches in our walls. There was a fence that sat around the temple where non-Jews couldn't go beyond that fence. That fence was the separation between the Jews and their environment. Ufartzu chomos migdalai, they broke down 13 pirzos. They made 13 breaches in that fence because they were trying to blur the lines between Jews and the world around them. They were advocating for assimilation. And that's why we find that pure oil, that unadulterated oil, that they were able to light in the Mikdash and send that message that we are still holding on to who we are. And that's what Melech Yavan tried to do. He ultimately was trying to destroy Yosef. He ultimately was trying to get rid of the value system of Yosef and what Yosef stood for. And that's why the gematria of Yosef is the same as Melech Yavan, the same as Antiochus. Because they were davka, poised against destroying Yosef. The sale of the brothers of Yosef, though it was based on hatred, but that sale, the danger of that crime was that they sent Yosef into Gullus, and that Yosef could have been completely lost and obliterated. And that sale needed to be atoned for, it needed to be cleansed. The moment that the Chashmonaim stood for who they were and said, we're not giving it up, that was the atonement for that terrible tragedy of the sale of Yosef, of the almost loss of setting that stage that would give us the strength throughout our history to hold on to who we were, that's exactly what we became. Jews that had the strength to look around our world and to say, I'm not giving up who I am. And that's one of the messages of Chanukah. As we stand in Modi'in, we stand all over the world, and we light those lights. We're Mekayim a mitzvah. We fulfill an obligation, a rabbinical obligation, to light the Chanukah lights. And with that, we send this incredibly powerful message to the world that not for 2,000 years have I given up who I am, and it's not going to happen. I'm not going to give it up. I'm going to hold strong. Like Yosef set the stage for me, like his brothers almost destroyed him, and that Yosef set the stage, the Chashmonoim lit those lights, and I do exactly the same thing. And as I make those brachas, they're not just brachas on a mitzvah, they are the loudest testimony that no matter how much you try to blur the lines, how much the world tries to make me lose who I am, I will never let go.